My fiancé called me too fat to be his bride. Then the Mafia boss married me in the same church. The morning of my wedding, I stood behind the doors of St. Bridget's, clutching a bouquet I had chosen myself, wearing a dress I had saved 11 months to buy. I believed the man waiting at the altar was the one person alive who would never use my body against me. I was 34. I was curvy. And I had told Peter Lane the secret I had told no one else on this earth. 90 minutes later, in front of 200 people, Peter looked at me and said the words that would rip my life in half. He said them slowly, like a man reading from a page he had practiced. He said them in the exact language of my oldest wound. And the most feared man in Buffalo was already sitting in the third pew from the back, watching, and he did not move. If you have ever trusted the wrong person with the softest part of yourself, stay with me. What happened next inside that church did not just change my life. It exposed a plot that had been quietly circling our neighborhood for over a year, involving 3 rival crime families, a florist's mistake that was not a mistake, and a set of side doors that never should have been chained. Give this video a like if you believe a woman's worth is never measured in pounds. Drop a comment telling me the city you're watching from. Now let me take you back to the morning that broke me open, and to the quiet man in the third pew who chose, of all things, to do nothing at all. My name is Molly Hart. For 8 years, I ran the community kitchen at St. Bridget's Catholic Parish in Buffalo. I fed steelworkers who had lost their pensions, grandmothers whose grocery money did not stretch past Wednesday, and kids whose mothers worked 2 shifts. The kitchen was not a job. It was the room where I had learned my worth after years of feeling invisible. It was also the room where I first noticed Peter, 3 summers earlier, when he showed up to serve Thanksgiving plates. Peter was warm then. He looked at me like I was a whole person, not a body he was tolerating. I remember thinking a man like that could never learn to be cruel. That was the first lie I told myself about him, and not the last. On our 3rd date, at a diner on Elmwood, I told him something I had never told my own mother. I told him about the summer I was 15, at a parish youth dance in that same building, when 3 older kids cornered me by the coat rack and used a word about my body I still cannot say out loud. I told him I hid in the back restroom crying for 2 hours. Peter held my hand across the table. He promised me my body was safe with him forever. He said it like a vow. I chose to believe him. I did not know then that a vow made in a quiet diner can be turned into a weapon in a loud church. I did not know that some men remember your softest confessions the way other men remember their debts. I should have paid closer attention to the small, strange things that morning. The florist delivered white carnations instead of the yellow roses and cornflowers I had ordered. When I called, the shop insisted my fiancé had approved the change 2 days earlier. I let it go. A bride who fights over flowers on her wedding day is a bride who has forgotten what matters. At the church, 3 older gentlemen I had never seen were already seated in the back pews. They wore dark suits far more expensive than the room around them. Peter's mother told me they were friends of a cousin. But Peter himself kept walking to the vestibule window, asking the ushers whether a man named Stefano Greco had arrived yet. He asked at least 4 times. I thought he was nervous. I thought his cousin's guests were making him self-conscious. I was wrong on both counts, and would not learn how wrong until a year later, in a parish hall full of the same white carnations. That morning, I only knew the word Stefano, and the way Peter's voice tightened every time he said it, and I chose, again, to let it go. I knew Stefano Greco by reputation. Everyone in our part of Buffalo did. He was the quiet man in the corner booth at Angelo's diner, the one whose name people lowered their voices to say. He was said to run an entire side of this city, and yet the same man had been anonymously paying our parish's heating bill for 6 winters. Father Keene never spoke his name out loud, but the checks came, and the freezer stayed full every January. I had seen Stefano twice at the kitchen back door, dropping off crates of chicken with an old woman who called him Stefanuccio. He had nodded at me once and asked if the burner on the left still leaked gas. He remembered. That was the strangest thing about him. He remembered the small, ordinary details other men forgot. He remembered which burner leaked and which grandmother had bad knees. That kind of memory, I would learn later, is what separates a boss from a bully. But that morning I only knew him as a roomer with a face, and Peter kept checking the window as if the roomer were a hurricane coming down Delancey Street toward us. 12 minutes before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, Father Keene came to the bride's room and told me the ceremony would be delayed. He would not say why. Behind him, I could see old Joseph Bellini, our senior usher, arguing quietly with two men near the side door. Joseph had been at St. Brigid's longer than I had been alive. When Joseph finally came into the bride's room, he took my hand in his shaking, spotted grip. His eyes were wet. He said, "Molly, if anything goes wrong in there today, do not leave through the front doors. You come out the back, past the sacristy, past the kitchen, out to Delancey Street. Do you hear me?" I nodded because I did not know what else to do. I thought he was being sentimental. I thought old men sometimes said strange things at weddings. His late wife had run our kitchen for 40 years before she passed, and I told myself he was thinking of her. That is the detail I still cannot forget. He was protecting me. I just did not know from what. The music started 12 minutes late. I walked. 200 faces turned toward me. Peter's face was the last one I looked at, because his was the face I had been walking toward for 3 years. He was pale. Sweat had cut a line down the collar of his rented tuxedo. Father Keene began the opening blessing, and Peter interrupted him. He put a hand on Father Keene's arm and stopped the man who had baptized half our neighborhood. Then he turned to face me. I watched his mouth move around the sentence that ended my old life. He said, loud enough for the microphone to catch every syllable, "Father, I can't marry her. Look at her. She's too fat to be my bride. I can't lie to God." I want you to understand what those words did inside my chest. Not because they were true, they were not, but because they were the exact wound I had trusted Peter with in the dark. He had reached into the softest part of me, taken out the knife I had let him hold for safekeeping, and used it on me in front of everyone I loved. My mother made a sound like an animal. My little niece began to cry. Somebody in the back row laughed once and choked it off. My best friend from grade school stood up from the second pew with both hands over her mouth. And in the third pew from the rear, sitting quietly with his hands folded, Stefano Greco did not move a single muscle. Behind Stefano, 3 of his younger men rose halfway from their seats. I saw the shift in the room the way you feel a train coming through the floor of a station. Something enormous was about to happen. Stefano lifted one finger, just one finger. His men sat back down without a word. And then Stefano himself stood, unhurried, and walked up the side aisle toward me. Peter stumbled backward on the altar step. Stefano did not look at him. He walked as if Peter were not in the room. He stopped 6 feet from me, kept a respectful distance, and spoke so softly the microphone did not catch it. "Miss Hart, you tell me what happens next. Anything. Nothing. Whatever you say inside this church today, that is what happens." I had spent my whole adult life being the woman who fixed everybody else's crisis. In that moment, I could not fix mine. But I could still make one choice out loud, and I could still make it mine. I looked at Stefano Greco, a man I had barely spoken 20 words to, and I heard myself say the one true thing I still owned. I want to walk out of here with my head up, and I do not want you to touch him. Not today, not next week, not ever, not in my name. Stefano did not blink. He simply nodded once and said, "Then that is what happens." He stepped aside so the aisle was open, and I walked. Past 200 stunned faces, past Joseph Bellini crossing himself, past the ushers holding open the back doors. I walked the whole length of that aisle in the opposite direction, and I did not look back at Peter once. If you already need to know what happened next, do me one small favor. hit the like button, and tell me in the comments what you would have said to Stefano Greco in that moment, because the answer I gave changed everything about what came after. On Monday morning, I went back to the kitchen. I want to be honest, I did not want to. I woke at 4 a.m. with my chest cracked open and begged God to let me disappear. I thought about my sister's spare room in Rochester. I thought about a bus ticket. I thought about becoming somebody new in a town where nobody had ever heard the phrase, "too fat to be his bride." Then I thought about the 22 families on our Monday food route who counted on me for their week. And I thought about how, if I let Peter Lane push me out of the one place that had ever loved me back, he had not only broken my heart, he had stolen my life. I was not willing to give him both. So I put on my apron and walked in at 6. I started chopping onions like nothing had happened. My hands were shaking. I chopped them anyway. The whispers were worse than I imagined. Volunteers I had trained for years suddenly went quiet when I came into the pantry. A woman I had known since confirmation crossed the street when she saw me on Fillmore Avenue. Somebody had already written the word, "Poor Molly," into the way they said my name. The parish council chair, a lawyer named Denise, sat me down in the office and gently asked whether I wanted to take a leave while things settled. I told her things had settled the moment I walked out of that church. If she wanted me gone, she would have to fire me herself, in writing. She did not fire me. She stood up, walked around her desk, and hugged me until she was the one crying. That was the first day I remembered that I was not the person Peter had described. I was the person who fed this neighborhood. And this neighborhood, once it decided which story it believed, was slower to abandon me than I had feared. By the end of that week, 3 volunteers I did not know well were showing up early to chop onions beside me without saying a word about the wedding. Stefano Greco did not appear the first week, or the second. When he did come, on a Thursday, he came in through the back door carrying 2 crates of ground beef and a case of canned tomatoes. He set them down next to the sink, washed his hands, and started dicing celery beside 78-year-old Rosa Costa. Rosa slapped his wrist because he was cutting the pieces too thick. He laughed. I had never heard him laugh. It was a small, embarrassed sound, and it startled me. He worked our lunch shift for 4 hours. When it was over, he took his coat off the hook and stopped by my station. He did not ask me to dinner. He did not offer condolences. He said, "The gas burner on the left. Did anyone ever fix that?" I told him no. He said he would send somebody Tuesday. He did. He sent a plumber who refused payment and would not tell me who had paid the bill. That was Stefano's way. Quiet, practical, never public. He never once, in any of the months that followed, sat me down and asked me how I was feeling. He simply arrived on Thursdays, chopped celery too thick, and let Rosa slap his wrist. It was the least performed kindness I had ever received from a man. I learned slowly that Stefano Greco had been paying our heating bill and half our produce order since 2013. Not because of me, not because of my wedding. Because when he was 8, in the winter of 1985, his mother walked him down Delancey Street in a coat that did not close. St. Bridget's Kitchen had fed them a bowl of pasta e fagioli and given him a pair of second-hand boots. The old woman who ladled that soup was Joseph Bellini's late wife. Stefano had never forgotten. He had also never told anyone. Father Keene told me only because he thought I needed to hear it. The week I was starting to wonder whether Stefano's kindness was a slow trap of a different kind. I asked Father Keene why Stefano had never wanted credit for the checks. Father Keene looked at me a long time. Then he said, "Because a man who needs to be thanked for feeding hungry people is not the same as a man who feeds them." I sat with that sentence a whole afternoon. I sat with it while I labeled freezer bags. I sat with it while I inventoried the flour, and by evening I had begun, cautiously, to believe it. While all of that was happening, the mystery of my wedding day would not leave me alone. I called the florist myself and asked to see the change order for the carnations. The girl pulled the file. She told me the request had come from a man named Peter, from a phone number that was not Peter's. It was a Buffalo number. She copied it down on the back of a receipt. I did not know whose number it was, but I knew it was not the number I had held in my phone for 3 years. I asked Joseph Bellini about the 12-minute delay next. He sat me down in the sacristy. He admitted he had asked Father Keene to hold the ceremony because he had walked the church at dawn and found something he could not unsee. He had found 3 of the 4 side exits chained shut from the outside. He cut the chains himself with bolt cutters from his truck. He had never told me, he said, because he had not wanted to frighten a bride on her wedding day. I hugged that old man in the sacristy for a long minute. Then I asked him about the 3 older men in the back. He looked at his hands a long time. Then he told me their names. Even I recognized them. They were not friends of any cousin. Each was the eldest surviving figure of one of the 3 other criminal families that shared our end of the state. 3 men who, in Joseph's 40 years of ushering, had never once attended a wedding together at St. Brigid's or anywhere else Joseph could recall. 3 men who did not belong in the same room. Joseph did not know why they had come. He only knew that whoever had put white carnations in my church and chains on my side doors had also put those 3 men in my back pew. And whoever had done all of that had wanted to be sure Stefano Greco was watching. That was the night I stopped grieving my wedding, and that was the night I started asking who had built it. That was also the night, driving home along Broadway in the rain, that I saw Peter Lane sitting on the concrete steps of my building. He had lost weight. His hands were shaking. He asked for 5 minutes. I gave him 10 on the porch, with the door open and my neighbor watching from across the hall. I did not let him inside. Peter told me a story I half believed. He said 18 months earlier he had lost $17,000 at a card room off Bailey Avenue, quietly owned by a man named Marco Salvi. The debt had grown. Interest payments had eaten his savings. He had been so ashamed he had never told me a word of it. He told me that 6 weeks before the wedding, Salvi's people had offered him a way to clear the whole debt. All he had to do, they said, was make sure his wedding went badly enough, and publicly enough, and cruelly enough that Stefano Greco would be forced to respond inside the church. I looked at Peter a long time. Then I asked the only question that mattered. Peter, who told you to say I was too fat to be your bride? Whose words were those? He would not look at me. He said Salvi's people had told him to humiliate me badly enough to make Stefano lose control. They had not written the sentence. He had. He had reached back into the story I told him on our 3rd date and used it because he knew it was the deepest cut he could make. He said he was sorry. He said he had been drowning. He said the word please a dozen times, each one smaller than the last. I told him a drowning man does not choose which bystander to pull under with him. I told him to leave. I told him if he ever came near St. Brigid's again, I would tell Stefano Greco myself, and I would not add the word please. He nodded. He stood up. He walked into the rain without an umbrella. I never saw him again. I want to be careful here. Peter was pressured. Peter was terrified. Peter was under the thumb of a man who had 100 quieter men behind him. All of that is true, but the exact insult, the one specific weapon he used, had not been dictated to him by anyone. He had reached for it because it was mine. He had reached for the one wound only he had been trusted with and used it in front of 200 people. That is the difference between a coward and a monster. It is a difference I made peace with slowly over months of chopping onions. I did not owe Peter forgiveness. What I owed myself was the truth about which parts of my humiliation had been business. The business had been Salvi's. The cruelty had been Peter's alone. And nobody, not Stefano, not the parish council, not the whispers on Fillmore Avenue, was going to blur that line for me. Nobody was going to tell me that a man under pressure gets to choose his own wife's oldest wound as his weapon and then call it a misfortune. That was not a misfortune. That was a choice. I told Stefano only some of it. I told him Peter had confessed to a gambling debt. I told him a man named Marco Salvi appeared to have arranged the wedding around Peter, and I told him I did not want him to touch either one of them. Stefano listened with his hands flat on the counter. When I finished, he was quiet for what felt like a full minute. Then he said, very quietly, that he had suspected something for months. But Salvi had built it so carefully that any move Stefano made would be the move Salvi wanted. He asked me what I wanted him to do. I told him I wanted him to do nothing. I wanted to keep working the kitchen. I wanted us to keep having coffee on Thursday afternoons. I wanted to stop being a chess piece. Stefano nodded. For the first time, I understood that a man with his kind of power showing restraint was not the same as a man without power staying still. It was harder. It cost him more. And he did it because I had asked him to. That was the moment I began to believe that this quiet man was not, in any way that mattered, a different version of Peter. Somewhere in those months, Thursday coffee became Saturday dinner. Saturday dinner became a slow, careful courtship neither of us named for a long time. Stefano did not flatter me. He did not tell me I was beautiful the way Peter had, in bright bursts meant to end conversations. He told me instead that the way I balanced our produce budget was the best financial work he had seen in a decade. He told me Rosa Costa said I was the only kitchen coordinator in 30 years who kept the recipe cards the way her mother had. He asked my opinion about things that had nothing to do with me, and listened. He never once mentioned my body. Not to compliment it, not to correct it, not to comment on it. He simply looked at me like a whole person. That was, it turned out, the only reassurance I had ever really needed from a man. It took me weeks to notice that absence. It took me months to trust it. Peter had been all noise. Stefano was almost entirely presence. And every Thursday, when Rosa slapped his wrist over the celery, one more piece of me settled back into place. Then September came, and with September came St. Bridget's annual autumn feast, the biggest event of our parish year. 400 people packed into the hall and spilled through the church for evening prayer. I was running kitchen operations. Stefano was pouring wine at the back table. Father Keene was blessing the bread. For the first hour, I felt something I had not felt inside those walls since the morning of the wedding. I felt at home again. My hands were steady. My laugh came easily. Then I walked past the entryway table where greeters were pinning boutonnieres onto older gentlemen, and I froze. Every single boutonniere in the wooden box was a white carnation. I had not ordered white carnations. I never would. I stood there with my hand over my mouth and felt the year come apart and stitch itself back together in a different shape. That was the moment the whole first wedding, every detail of it, began snapping into place like the pieces of a puzzle I had carried in my pocket for a year. The carnations were not decoration. They were a signal. They were how somebody's people identified each other in a crowded room without a spoken word. And if the carnations were here, then the rest of it was here too. I turned very slowly. I looked at the back of the hall, and there, near the double doors that opened onto Delancey Street, stood a soft-faced man in rimless glasses with a folded program in his hand. He was quietly directing 3 younger men toward specific corners of the room. Marco Salvi. I knew it in my bones before Joseph Bellini came up beside me and whispered his name. I did not scream. I did not panic. I did what a kitchen coordinator does. I did what the woman who had walked out of her own broken wedding with her head up does. I moved. I went first and found Father Keene. I told him, quietly, that we needed to move him and every parishioner over 70 into the sacristy and the kitchen, right now, on the pretext of an early blessing of the harvest baskets. Then I found Joseph and asked him to unlock every side door of the church and prop them open with the wooden wedges we used for summer air. No exit could be quietly sealed the way it had been on my wedding morning. Not tonight. He was already reaching for the wedges before I finished the sentence. That old man had been waiting a year to be asked. Then I found Stefano at the back table. I put my hand on his arm. I said the sentence I had rehearsed on the way across the hall. My voice did not shake. Stefano, it is happening again. The carnations are here. Salvi is here. And I need you to promise me that none of your men will lay a hand on any human being inside this church tonight, no matter what he does, no matter what he says." Stefano looked at me for a very long moment. This was the man everyone in the city was afraid of. This was the man whose one lifted finger had frozen an entire wedding. And I was standing in front of him telling him to hold still while a rival tried to burn down his life in public. He said quietly, "Molly, if I do nothing and he moves on you personally, I will not be able to live with that." I told him I was not asking him to be no one. I was asking him to trust that I had seen the shape of the trap before it closed. I was asking him to trust that the way we won was by refusing to be the animal Salvi needed us to be. He closed his eyes for 1 second. Then he nodded and walked out into the hall. He told his 4 closest men, in a voice I have never heard him use before or since, that any man of his who touched anyone inside St. Brigid's that night would answer to him personally the next morning. They nodded. They stepped back from the wine tables. They put their hands in their pockets. And they became, for the first time in their lives, ordinary parishioners in an ordinary church hall. Whatever happened next was going to happen without them, and whatever happened next was, unmistakably, about to happen. Salvi made his move 10 minutes later. He walked to the center of the hall, holding a glass of wine, speaking loudly enough for the whole room to hear. He addressed Stefano by name. He insulted his mother. He insulted his dead father. He insulted the boy Stefano had been in a coat that would not close on Delancey Street. He insulted everything a proud man of Stefano's generation had been raised to answer with his fists, or worse. The 3 old men from my wedding, the 3 heads of the rival families, were seated at 3 different tables, watching every word. It was exactly the setup from the church, only larger, in front of even more people. And Stefano Greco, the most feared man on our end of Buffalo, stood by the wine table with his hands folded and did not move. He did not raise his voice. He did not step forward. He did not so much as clench his jaw. He simply stood there in his gray suit and let Marco Salvi shout at him until Salvi ran out of breath and the room began to lean forward. Then Stefano did something I had not expected, something I do not think Salvi had prepared for either. He looked past Salvi, at each of the 3 old men in turn. He said calmly, "Vincent, Alberto, Carmine, every one of you was in my parish's back pew a year ago, at a wedding that had nothing to do with any of your houses. And every one of you is here again tonight, at a harvest feast, at the same church." He let that sentence settle. Then he went on. "I want each of you, out loud, in this room, to tell every soul here who invited you to Molly Hart's wedding, and who invited you here tonight." The hall went silent. You could hear the flame in the votive rack down the hallway. Salvi's face changed. His mouth opened once and closed again. He turned toward Vincent, the oldest, and I watched something small and desperate move behind his rimless glasses. One by one, each of those 3 old men said the same name. Vincent said it first, low and rough. "Marco Salvi." Alberto said it next, without looking at Salvi. "Marco Salvi." Carmine, the youngest, took a long, slow breath, set his fork down, and said it a little louder than the other 2. "Marco Salvi." 3 names, 3 witnesses. That was the moment Salvi's whole plan collapsed. Not with a gunshot, not with a fistfight, not with anything you would see in a movie. It collapsed with 3 quiet words in a room full of witnesses. The scheme had depended on those 3 old men believing they had come as neutral observers to watch Stefano Greco disgrace himself on sacred ground. That belief died in 3 syllables. The instant they realized they had been used, twice, and that they were the audience Salvi had built his coalition around, they were no longer his allies. They were his problem. Vincent, the oldest, set down his glass. He said into the silence, "Marco, you brought me to a church twice. I will not be brought a third time." Then he walked out. The other two followed him without a word. Salvi was left standing in the middle of the parish hall with a glass of wine in his hand, a room full of parishioners staring at him, and no coalition left to command. His right hand began to shake. Nobody touched him. Father Keene walked up to Marco Salvi with his old, careful steps, gently took the glass of wine out of his hand, and asked him to please leave the parish grounds and not to return. Salvi looked around the room once. He looked at me, briefly. I did not look away. Then he set his folded program down on the nearest table, turned, and walked out through the same doors his own men had been guarding. That was the end of Marco Salvi in our neighborhood. His coalition fell apart within a month. 2 of the 3 families reportedly told him they would no longer take his calls. He moved south the following winter. He never set foot in St. Bridget's again. Neither did Peter Lane. Peter apologized in a long, handwritten letter I read once and put in a shoebox under my bed. I did not answer it. Some doors, once you have walked out of them with your head up, are not meant to be opened again. If you have made it this far with me tonight, do me one last favor. Give this story a like if you believe the finest revenge a woman can take is refusing to become someone smaller than she was. And tell me in the comments whether you would have walked back into that same church for a second wedding. Because that is exactly what I did. Stefano proposed on a Tuesday in April, in the kitchen at St. Bridget's, after the last dish had been washed and the last light in the parish hall switched off. He did not kneel, because his left knee had never worked right since a car accident in his 30s. He simply stood across the counter from me, dried his hands on the towel, and asked me if I would stand at that altar with him one day and mean it. My heart did not race. It settled. That is how I knew. I said yes. Then I told him I had 2 conditions. The wedding would be at St. Bridget's, in the same sanctuary, at the same altar, and I would wear the same gown Peter had left me standing in, restored and altered by the same seamstress who had made it in the first place. Stefano's face went very still. He asked me very carefully whether that would hurt me. I told him it would only hurt if I let another man decide whether I could ever walk into my own church again in my own dress. He looked at me across that counter a long moment. Then he said, "Molly, if that is what you want, then that is what happens." It was the second time he had spoken those words to me. I married Stefano Greco on a Saturday in October at St. Bridget's in a restored dress the color of cream. My original bouquet returned, yellow roses and cornflowers from the same little shop on Fillmore Avenue. Every side door of the church stood wide open to the autumn sunlight. Joseph Bellini, 80 years old that month, ushered me in himself. His old spotted hand rested steady on my elbow. He did not need to warn me about any doors this time. Father Keene waited at the altar with the same blessing he had begun a year and a half earlier. Stefano's men sat like anyone else's family, in ordinary clothes, no politics near the pews. Stefano himself did not walk down that aisle to retrieve me. He stood at the altar in a simple dark suit and waited, because he understood, in a way that had taken me my whole life to learn to demand from a man, that the woman walking toward him was not being delivered. She was arriving under her own power. I walked the same aisle I had once fled. 200 faces turned. My mother was crying, but softly this time, the good kind of crying. My little niece, taller now by 4 inches, threw the petals she had been holding. Rosa Costa nodded at me from the 3rd pew, the way she nodded at a pot of sauce that had finally come right. And when I reached Stefano, I did not look back for permission. I did not look down at myself for approval. Because at some point during that long, strange year, I had stopped needing either. I had stopped asking rooms whether I was welcome inside them. Stefano took my hand in both of his. Father Keene finished the blessing he had started once before, and in the exact spot where one man had called me too fat to be his bride in front of 200 people, I heard a different man, a quieter man, a better man, promise before God to spend the rest of his life across the counter from me, listening to every word I said. I did not cry during the vows. I cried during the "I do." That was the part I had not been sure I would ever get to say out loud again. That was the part Peter had tried to take from me. When those words came out of my mouth in front of the same altar, in the same dress, they came out steady and whole and mine. I still run the kitchen at St. Brigid's. Rosa Costa still slaps Stefano's wrist when he dices the celery too thick. He still laughs that small, embarrassed laugh. Every time I hear it, I remember the Thursday he first walked in carrying 2 crates of ground beef, not knowing what to do with his hands until Rosa put a knife in one of them. Joseph Bellini still checks the side doors before every parish event. Now his grandson checks them with him, and the two of them argue about whether the wedges need replacing. The heating bill still gets paid, quietly, the way it always has. Every Sunday morning, I walk into a sanctuary that once tried very hard to be the room where I disappeared. And I do not disappear inside it. I remember instead that a woman's body is not a debt she owes the world's opinion of it. It is a home. Mine was always mine. It took one broken wedding, one carefully quiet feast, one collapsed coalition, and one man who understood the difference between protecting me and standing beside me, to walk back through my own front door and understand that I had been holding the key all along.